All right, so today we're unpacking a really ambitious idea from our source material. The claim? That you can explain the entire sweep of human history by looking at just a few key things: geography, big historical moments, and the ideas that push us forward. It's a bold claim, so let's see how they try to pull it off.
I mean, that's a massive question, right? How on earth could one single map explain all of world history? You're talking about thousands of years of conflict, invention, change. It seems, kind of impossible.
But the source we're digging into today says, hold on, we've got a model for that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to break this framework down piece by piece and really try to get a handle on how it's built and what it's trying to tell us about our world.
Okay, so where does it all start? Well, the whole thing is built on a foundation. Think of it like a static world map, but it's been carved up into 4 distinct civilizational blocks. This is the bedrock, the starting point for everything else.
And right at the heart of this map, the source puts Jerusalem and Israel. It sees this area as the spiritual center of the world, sort of the anchor point that everything else is measured against. First up, we've got Western civilization. Places like the US, Western Europe, Canada, Australia. The source says its foundation is a mix of Judeo-Christian values, capitalism, and democracy, and that it was mostly spread by the British Empire. And it makes a really big claim right out of the gate, that this particular combo is the only one in all of history that's ever created a high quality of life.
All right, next is the Islamic civilization. And this one covers a massive chunk of the globe: North Africa, the Middle East, all the way into parts of Asia. According to this framework, it's defined by Islam and Sharia law, usually with authoritarian governments. And it's spread throughout history. The source attributes that to conquest.
So the third block is what it calls Eastern civilization. We're talking China, India, Japan, that whole region. The basis here is identified as polytheism, think Hinduism and Buddhism, and the source actually uses the term pagan culture to describe it. It says the modern version of this civilization is a mix of 3 big things: its ancient past, the hit it took from Western imperialism, and then, of course, the rise of communism.
And that brings us to the 4th and final region, which the source calls the imperialized world. This is mostly South America and Africa. And its history, according to this view, is basically one of domination, shaped by what it calls guns, steel, and disease, tribalism, and just a long legacy of being underdeveloped.
So there you have it. That's the foundational map. You've got these 4 major blocks, each with its own basis, its own laws, its own government, at least according to this model. And this static map, well, this is the stage where all the action is about to happen.
But, a map is just a picture, a snapshot. It doesn't move. So the next layer of this framework is what makes it move: the engine of history. The source points to 5 specific eras that it says just completely changed the game and redrew this map.
So here they are. These are the 5 periods it sees as the big drivers of change. We start with the Reformations leading to revolutions, then the Industrial Revolution and imperialism, the World Wars, the Cold War, and finally, the clash we see today: globalism versus populism. The idea here is that each of these was a massive shift in who holds the power.
Let's take that first era, Reformations to revolutions. This was a time that just shattered the old way of doing things. The Western Church, which had been unified, split apart with the rise of Protestantism. Big empires, like the British and French, started to lose their grip. And this is a key point in the source, this is when we get the birth of the whole left versus right political divide, which it says started to challenge those traditional Judeo-Christian values. Next up, the Industrial Revolution and imperialism. This just completely rewired society, right? We went from farms to factories and cities. But what's really interesting here is how the source frames the result. It says, yeah, Western civilization spread everywhere, but in doing so, it split the world into what it calls winners and losers.
Then came the World Wars, and boom, another massive seismic shift. Before the wars, Europe was the center of the universe, power-wise. But after 2 absolutely brutal conflicts, the source says Europe was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed as a dominant power. And out of those ashes, a new reality emerged, a 2-player game, with the USA and the USSR as the new superpowers.
And that brings us to the Cold War. The whole era was defined by this head-to-head conflict: capitalism versus communism, playing out all over the world. But it all came to a dramatic end with one key event: the fall of the Soviet Union. And with that, according to this framework, the USA was left as the last one standing, the only real superpower.
Okay, so we've got our map, the stage, and we've got our history, the engine that changes the stage. But what's the fuel for that engine? Well, the source adds a third layer here, the battle of ideas, or as it calls them, the isms.
These are the man-made concepts that it says are really driving all the conflict.
And this is a really critical point in the source material. It makes the argument that all of these isms, every single one, is flawed. Why? Because they're man-made. They're human inventions, not something divinely inspired. And that single idea really colors how it looks at everything else. So let's look at a few of these isms. First, you've got capitalism. Pretty standard definition here. Private ownership, free markets, you know the drill. And in this particular framework, capitalism is seen as the absolute core economic engine of Western civilization. And what was capitalism's main rival in the 20th century? Well, of course, it was communism. The whole idea of a classless society where everything is publicly owned, that was a direct threat to the West. And that clash of ideas is what fueled the entire Cold War.
So once the Cold War ends, a new ism takes center stage in this framework: globalism. And this is presented as the big idea of a super-connected world, linked by trade and technology, where working together internationally becomes more important than just focusing on your own country.
And for every action, there's a reaction, right? The main pushback against globalism in this model is populism. It's framed as a direct response from regular folks who feel like the global elites have just completely forgotten about them and their problems.
Okay, so this brings all the pieces together for the final act. We're looking at the source's take on right now, our present moment. It argues that all these layers we've talked about, the map, the history, the isms, they've all boiled down to one single defining conflict.
And here it is, the main event, according to the source. On one side, you have globalism. It says this is pushed by global elites who are trying to create a new world order. The ideology fueling this, it claims, is something it calls cultural Marxism, which it defines as an attack on traditional Western values. Then on the other side, you've got populism. This is represented by figures like Donald Trump and movements like MAGA, and it's framed as a patriotic, national-level fight against those very elites. The source's big takeaway is that this showdown right here is the central conflict of our time.
So, let's recap the whole thing. You've got a four-part map of civilizations. That map gets shaken up by 5 major historical eras, and the whole thing is powered by a battle of competing isms. The source material lands on this conclusion that the big fight right now is globalism versus populism. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If history is this engine that's always changing the map, what's the next big idea that's going to come along and redraw it all over again?